5 military working dogs. Between them, nearly a decade of classified deployments, 3 combat theaters, and commendations that mostly lived in sealed files nobody was supposed to open. And on a cold Wednesday morning at Fort Carver Army Base outside Breckenridge, Colorado, all 5 of them stopped responding to anyone. They had been declining for 43 days. Staff Sergeant Boyd Marin had watched it happen in real time, had written it into the incident log, had filed 3 formal requests that went up the chain and came back with the digital equivalent of a shrug. But that Wednesday morning was different. That Wednesday morning, Dagger, a 9-year-old Dutch shepherd who had spent 6 years locating IEDs in terrain that would have broken most men, got out. Not through aggression, not through force. He simply found the gap in the kennel latch that had been reported as needing repair for 11 weeks. And he walked through it, and when Corporal Suki Tanaka tried to redirect him, he looked at her in a way that she later described, quietly, as the way something looks when it has already made a decision about you. He didn't hurt her, he just kept walking. It took 4 handlers and 35 minutes to get Dagger back into his kennel. In that time, the other 4 dogs, Scout, Pepper, Recon, and a black Malinois named Flint, had moved to the corners of their individual enclosures and were doing the thing that was harder to manage than barking. They were silent. The sustained, watchful, interior silence of animals in a level of distress that no longer had anywhere to go. Dr. Jonas Irby, the on-base veterinary officer, was standing outside the kennel block at 0730 rubbing his face when Marin came out to give him the update. 43 days, Irby said. 43 days, Marin confirmed. And before the contract was cut. Marin didn't answer. They both already knew the answer. The behavioral health contract had been terminated 8 weeks ago by Deputy Director Glenna Faust, head of Base Support Services. The specific number was $22,000, which was the annual cost of the Canine Behavioral Health Consulting Program that Irby had spent 2 years building with a specialist team out of Fort Lewis. Faust had cut it in a budget reallocation memo that was 3 paragraphs long and cited maintenance upgrades to the administrative complex as the destination for the funds. The administrative complex's maintenance had been completed 4 months prior to the memo, funded by a separate line item. Nobody had noticed that discrepancy yet, or if they had, they hadn't said so where anyone could hear them. "I have a request in to bring the Fort Lewis team back," Irby said. "I've had a request in for 3 weeks. What's the timeline?" Irby looked at the kennel block. From where they stood, they could hear nothing from inside, which was worse than hearing something. They said 10 days. Marin said nothing. "I know," Irby said. The base had a staffing problem that Faust Office had created, and Faust Office showed no urgency in solving. Marin had 18 years in the Army, 12 of them running working dog programs, and in all that time, he had not found a language that successfully translated what behavioral deterioration looked like in a combat retired animal to someone who measured institutional health in spreadsheet columns. He'd tried. The incident log was 34 pages long. Faust had received every page and responded to none of them. He was standing there, trying to figure out what he had left in the toolkit when Specialist Arden Cho called over from the base road. "Sergeant Marin, there's a civilian at the south gate. She's got a temp credential through the medical center. Says she heard about the situation, asking if she can come in." Marin turned, asking to come in where? "Here, Sergeant, the kennel block." The civilian's name was Thea Corbett. She was 31 years old, 5'4", in gray athletic pants and a faded green zip-up that had a patch on the sleeve worn down to the point where whatever had been on it was no longer legible. She was carrying a canvas gym bag, military surplus, not the nylon kind, and a travel mug with the lid slightly loose. Her hair was in a knot at the base of her neck. She looked, in all the most complete ways, like someone who had wandered over on a lunch break. "Can I help you?" Marin said. "I heard about the situation from someone in the PT clinic." Her voice was easy, not performatively calm, just easy, the way a room is easy when the right person is in it. "I've worked with dogs before, canines. I thought I might be useful." "You're from the medical center?" "Temporarily. I'm covering a leave in the physical therapy unit. I've been here 5 weeks." Marin studied her. He had the look that people develop after a certain number of years of assessing situations quickly, the look that was not unfriendly but was not casual either. What kind of background with canines? She looked past him toward the kennel block for a moment, then back. I'd rather show you than explain it. Explaining it takes longer and sounds less convincing. Marin's protocols said no. His protocols said uncredentialed civilians did not enter active animal management situations, and they especially did not enter when the situation involved 5 retired combat veterans who had been in documented crisis for 43 days and whose behavioral unpredictability was now officially in the incident log under the word volatile. He looked at the kennel block. He looked at Irby. Irby had the expression of a man who was out of good options and was trying to decide how he felt about the remaining ones. He let her in. Dagger was still on heightened alert when Corbett came through the kennel door, pacing the back wall, hackles up, tracking the sound of every footstep in the corridor. 3 handlers were spaced at intervals, doing everything correctly, not making eye contact, not advancing, keeping their bodies sideways and loose. It wasn't working. Corbett set her travel mug on a flat surface near the door. She unzipped her bag slowly, made the motion without removing anything. Just let whatever was inside the bag move through the air. Then she stood up, and she walked toward Dagger's kennel at a pace that Marin did not have a word for. Not slow, not fast. Something in between that had a quality to it he couldn't immediately name. She stopped 6 feet from the gate. Her hands were at her sides. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, I've got you. Dagger stopped pacing. It wasn't immediate. He circled once, twice, made a low sound in his chest, but within 2 minutes he had settled to the floor with his head up and his eyes still watchful, and his body no longer doing the coiled brace thing it had been doing all morning. In the adjacent kennel, Recon, a 10-year-old black lab mix who had done 4 narcotic deployments and who had not voluntarily moved toward the gate in 3 weeks, stood up from his corner. He walked to the front of his enclosure and put his nose to the air. Marin stood very still. How did you do that? He said. He kept his voice low without meaning to. Dagger's startled response is tactile, not primarily auditory, Corbett said, not looking away from the dog. He's reading body tension in the people around him. Everyone in here is physically braced, waiting for something to go wrong. He's reading that as confirmation that something is going to go wrong. She paused. He needs the environment to change, not him. Marin looked at the dog. He looked at Corbett. Irby, he said. Yeah, Irby said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Faust arrived at the kennel block at 0930, which was earlier than Marin had anticipated, and in the precise manner that Faust arrived everywhere, walking slightly ahead of her own schedule, as though time itself owed her a few minutes. She had been informed by her aide that the morning's incident was stabilizing. She had taken this to mean it had been resolved. She came through the kennel door and found a woman she didn't recognize crouching in the corridor outside Flint's enclosure. The Malinois was pressed against the chain link on the inside, nose through the gap, breathing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Who is that? Faust said. Temp medical staff, Marin said. She's been helping manage the behavioral situation. She's crouching on the floor. Yes, ma'am. Faust walked forward. The register of her voice shifted in the way it shifted when she wanted to communicate that a situation was inconvenient. Excuse me, miss. Corbett, Thea said, without looking up. Mrs. Corbett, I appreciate whatever you've been doing here, but this is a military installation, and these animals are under the care of assigned veterinary personnel. I need you to collect your things and return to your assigned work area. Corbett looked up then. Her face was neutral, not argumentative, not apologetic. Just present, the way a fact is present. 3 of these dogs haven't eaten in 4 days. Flint has been standing guard at that back wall since Monday, which means he's identified a threat queue that no one has addressed. Scout, the Malinois at the far end, has lost almost 8% of his body weight since the behavioral contract ended. She met Faust's eyes. If you remove me now, you're going to have a harder morning than you've already had. Faust stared at her. She's right, Marin said from the side. About the weight. I documented it. It's in the log, Deputy Director. I didn't ask for your input, Staff Sergeant. No, ma'am, offering it anyway. The corridor got tight. Faust looked at Irby, who had the expression of someone who was working very hard not to say anything. She looked back at Corbett. You have no standing to be in this facility. I'm going to ask you one more time to gather your things. Corbett stood. She didn't rush it. You can ask me to leave. That's your call, but I'd suggest you give it until end of day and see what the situation looks like. She held Faust's gaze. The dogs know when a decision is about them. They read it. It'd be better if the decision was the right one. Faust told Marin politely to escort her out. Marin walked Corbett to the kennel block exit. They stood at the door for a moment. You heard her, Marin said. I heard her, Corbett agreed. She picked up her bag. She picked up her travel mug. She walked out into the cold morning and was 20 yards down the base road when Marin's radio crackled. Staff Sergeant, it was Tanaka. We have a problem with Scout. Scout was 11 years old. He had been retired from active service 14 months ago, not because of injury, but because his handler, a sergeant named Patrick Ogle, had died in a non-combat accident during a training exercise in the Mojave. Scout had been with Ogle for 6 years. He had never been fully assigned to another handler since. He existed in a space that the behavioral health consultant had described in her final report before the contract was cut as prolonged grief response with compounding isolation triggers, which was the clinical way of saying that Scout had decided 14 months ago that the world was no longer a reliable place and had been waiting quietly for confirmation of that ever since. He wasn't in crisis the way Dagger had been. He wasn't pacing or guarding or vocalizing. He had simply, sometime in the last hour, moved to the center of his enclosure and lain down on his side and stopped responding to anything. Tanaka's voice, Irby's commands, the food placed 6 inches from his nose. Marin got there and stood in the kennel doorway and understood, in the way 18 years teaches a person to understand things, that Scout was not resting. He called Corbett's number. He hadn't gotten it from her. He had looked it up in the base medical directory in the 4 minutes since the radio call. She picked up on the first ring. Scout, he said. He's down, not cardiac, behavioral. He's shutting down. A half second. I'm coming back. You've got revoked access. I know, she said. I'm coming anyway. She was through the gate in 4 minutes. She moved differently than she had earlier, the ease still there, but something sharper underneath it, more deliberate, the same way weather changes in mountain country from one side of a ridge to the other. Marin met her at the kennel block door and didn't say anything about the revoked access, because the access was not the problem he needed her help with. She went straight to Scout's kennel. She didn't rush the approach. She lowered herself to the floor outside the gate, knees on concrete, and she put her hand flat against the chain link, and she didn't speak. Scout didn't move. She stayed. 1 minute, 2. Tanaka was in the doorway behind Marin. The corridor was absolutely still. At the 3-minute mark, Scout's ear moved. One ear, just slightly, rotating toward the fence. Corbett said nothing. She kept her hand against the chain link. At minute 5, Scout raised his head. Tanaka made a sound she immediately swallowed. She was 24 years old and had been handling dogs for 2 years, and she was clearly trying very hard to keep her face professional. She didn't quite manage it. Scout got to his feet slowly, the careful movement of an old dog with something to prove to himself, and he walked to the fence. He pressed his nose against Corbett's knuckles. Marin stood in the corridor and felt something he couldn't locate precisely. He had been in enough rooms with enough animals in enough states of distress to have developed a working model of what was possible, and what he was watching was outside that model. Scout had not voluntarily approached a human being in 14 months. Marin knew this because he had watched it and documented it and found no solution for it. He had found one this morning, and she was crouching on his kennel floor with her hand through the fence. Faust's radio call came at 10:30. Marin's aide relayed it. The civilian's access was formally revoked as of now, and she was to be removed from the facility. Marin stood in the corridor, looking at Corbett and Scout. He put the radio on his belt without responding. He walked to Faust's side of things and bought 20 minutes by citing the active contact and the behavioral risk of interruption mid-approach. It was a legitimate argument. He made it with the even, professional voice of a person who was not starting a fight, just making a record. He went back and told Corbett she had until the aide sent someone herself. Corbett stood. Scout stayed at the fence, watching her prepare to leave. "Tanaka," Corbett said. "Ma'am." "Same approach, every time. Low and slow. Let him come to you. If he doesn't come, you sit outside the fence, and you wait and you don't ask anything from him. That's not failure. That's the only thing that actually works." She looked at the younger woman. "He's going to test whether you're the kind of person who stays when it's not rewarding. Make sure he finds out you are." Tanaka's jaw was set in the way it got when she was managing something. Marin walked Corbett out. At the gate, she stopped. "Whatever they put in the log about this morning," she said, "make sure Irby's notes are in there too. The weight, the documented timeline, the number of recommendations that were filed and not answered." "I know how to make a record," Marin said. "I know you do," she almost smiled, "the kind that carries something. I'm just saying make one." She went through the gate. Marin spent the next hour on the phone. He called Colonel Ray Holden at the Regional Animal Welfare Oversight Office, a woman he had worked with once on a handler training review 2 years back, and he told her the outline in the flat, factual language of someone who had been building a case for 43 days and was now presenting it. Holden listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 questions, all of them specific, and then said, "Get me the documentation by end of day. I'll look at what I can do." He hung up and went back to work. He found out that evening, from his aide, that Corbett's file had a classification code attached, not a notation. An actual code, the kind you only saw on records, that had been processed by a tier of operations that most people on an army base of Carver's size had no reason to encounter. His aide named the code. Marin recognized it. You didn't forget a code like that. He asked Irby the next morning what he knew about Corbett's background. Irby had let her in. He'd had a reason. She said she had field, Irby said. She said she'd worked with K-9 units in operational contexts. And that was enough. Irby was quiet for a moment. She walked up to Dagger, and he sat down in 2 minutes. "I've had certified behavioral specialists on this base who couldn't get him to stop pacing." He picked up his coffee. That was enough. Marin called Corbett that afternoon. She replied 11 minutes later, "Can we talk?" They met after her shift at a picnic table outside the base commissary. The mountains to the west had cloud cover building along the ridgeline. It was the kind of afternoon that told you snow was 4 hours away. "How long?" Marin said. She looked at the mountains. 13 years, give or take. K-9 operations. Medical support for K-9 operations in contexts that don't appear in standard deployment records. A pause. "When a dog was hurt in the field, I was there. When a handler was hurt and the dog needed someone who could manage the situation without alarming the unit, I was there." She stopped. "And sometimes when the mission required someone who could move through an environment without the dogs reacting, because dogs don't lie, and they'll alert on a person who's carrying the wrong kind of tension. I was used for that too." Marin was quiet. He knew what that last part meant. He'd been around long enough to know the specific shape of that kind of sentence. 5 years ago, she said, before he could ask, "I separated. Medical reasons, official record. The real reasons aren't in the file." "Scout," Marin said. "He reacted to you." She looked at her hands. "I knew his handler, Patrick Ogle. We served in the same task force for 3 years. Not on every mission, but enough." She paused. "I was there when he was evacuated out of Kandahar, not the training accident that went into the official record. A different time. One that didn't get filed anywhere." A breath. "Scout was with him. I was the one who managed the dog until the handler team could secure him. Scout would have been 4 years old." She looked toward the kennel block. "Dogs don't forget the way people pretend they don't." Marin sat with that for a long moment. "He put something in my bag that day," she said. "When they were loading Ogle onto the aircraft, one of the junior handlers handed me Ogle's field notebook. Said he'd want me to have it." She looked at the mountains. There was a page near the back. Ogle had written out the unit welfare guidelines he'd drafted for the task force. The last line said, "No dog is to be left waiting for a person who isn't coming back." She paused. He wrote it for the dogs, but he underlined it twice. A pause. I think he meant it for us too. The next morning, Faust filed a formal complaint to the Regional Administrative Board, citing unauthorized civilian access, potential security breach, and dereliction of duty on the part of assigned personnel, specifically named Staff Sergeant Boyd Marin and Dr. Jonas Irby. The complaint arrived at the board at 0842. Colonel Holden's preliminary inquiry from the night before arrived at 0751. The board flagged the collision. They escalated. Holden called Marin at 10:15. "Site inspection," she said, 72 hours, 2 of my officers and an independent auditor. A pause. The dual submission triggered automatic elevation. I didn't have to push. Faust is going to prepare. She's going to have 72 hours, Holden said. That's all she's going to have. The inspection team arrived on the morning of the third day. They worked methodically, without telegraphing conclusions, in the way that external review teams do when the documentation they're reviewing has already told them most of what they need to know. The auditor flagged the maintenance project discrepancy in the contract termination memo before noon. By afternoon, she was using the phrase irregular allocation in her working notes. Marin found out from Holden, who sent him a text that said, "It's there." He was sitting outside the kennel block when he read it. Inside, he could hear the low ambient sounds of 5 dogs in something that was beginning, cautiously, imperfectly, to resemble calm. Corbett had been given a temporary consultation designation through a phone call that Holden had made to someone who had then made another call, and the legitimacy of it was retroactive to her original presence on the block, which everyone involved understood but no one said directly. She was in with Flint when Marin came to find her. Flint was the one who had taken longest. He had been a protection deterrent dog on classified assignments for 4 years, and the nature of that work had given him a kind of permanent assessment stance. He never fully decided a person was safe. He only decided they were not yet dangerous. 6 months of isolation and staff turnover and budget-driven disruption had pushed that stance into something harder to walk back. Corbett had been working with him for 2 days in the same way she worked with all of them. Slowly, consistently, without asking anything, letting the dog determine the pace of everything. Flint was at the front of his enclosure. Not pressed against the gate, but at the front, watching her with the focused, calculating attention of an animal doing the very specific work of deciding something. "The preliminary findings are in," Marin told her. "Irregular allocation on the maintenance budget. 4 ignored welfare recommendations with documented receipt. The pattern goes back further than the contract cut. The auditor found decisions from 10 months ago." Corbett looked at Flint. "What happens to Faust?" "Formal administrative review. Holden told me this morning that Faust has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." He leaned against the kennel doorframe. "She did the same thing at her last posting. Different program, same pattern. That's why it moved fast." The board had prior context. Corbett nodded. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a person who has watched a necessary thing happen and is feeling the weight of the fact that it needed to happen at all. "The dogs are going to need consistent work," she said. "Not just maintenance. Real behavioral rehabilitation. Same handlers, same schedule, same approach. You can't rotate people through and expect the trust to hold." "I know. Irby and I are building the protocol. I want your framework before you leave." She looked at him. "Before you leave," he said again carefully, "because you are. I'm not pretending otherwise. But what you know about each of these 5 animals is not replaceable, and I'm not going to lose it when you walk out." Flint moved. Both of them went still. The dog took 2 steps toward the fence, testing. His nose came up, reading the air, reading Corbett, reading something in the situation that he was apparently finding sufficient. He took 1 more step. He pressed his nose against the chain link. Marin let the moment exist without filling it. "I'll write it up," Corbett said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn spiral notebook, the kind with the water-damaged cardboard cover, and she set it on her knee and opened it. The pages were already dense with small, careful handwriting. Notes she had been making since the first morning, specific to each dog, building a map that nobody had asked her to build and that nobody else could have built the same way. Marin left her there and went back to deal with the inspection team's follow-up questions. He was halfway across the base road when his phone buzzed. His aide had forwarded something from the records the auditor had pulled from Faust's administrative files. A scanned document, military service record, partially redacted. He recognized the format. The name at the top was a code designation. But the photograph in the upper corner, small, grainy, scanned from an old print, showed a woman who was unmistakably Thea Corbett at approximately 22 years old. The date of service at the top of the document began 12 years before the date she had given him. He stood on the base road holding his phone and did the math. She had told him 13 years, give or take. The document said 12 from this record alone, which meant there was at least one earlier record, at least one earlier identity. He called her. She picked up on the second ring. There's a document in Faust's admin files, he said. Service record. Scanned in from a records consolidation about 9 months ago. Your photograph. A unit designation I've only seen twice in 18 years. A silence that lasted 3 seconds. How did it get into her files? Someone was doing a batch scan of historical base records and didn't know what they were looking at. He paused. There's a line at the bottom of the document. Half of it's blacked out. The part that's legible says, no dog is to be left waiting for a person who isn't coming back. The silence this time lasted 5 full seconds. That was Ogle's language, she said finally. The words came out careful and underneath them something that wasn't either of those things. He wrote the unit welfare guidelines for the task force. That phrase was his. He put it in for the dogs, and then he put it in for everything else. She went quiet for a moment. I didn't know it made it into the formal record. I thought it was just the notebook. Marin stood on the base road with the mountains going dark in the early afternoon. The document goes into the inspection record, he said. I know. That means your service history becomes part of a formal inquiry. Let it, she said. He went back to his office and added 3 items to the documentation package he was building for Holden. The scanned record, the service date discrepancy, and a memo of his own summarizing the timeline of Corbett's involvement and the outcome for each animal. He wrote it precisely, and he did not minimize anything. Faust's formal review took 3 weeks. The findings ran 48 pages. The irregular allocation was documented in detail with the auditor's analysis attached. The 4 ignored welfare recommendations were reproduced in full. The 2 prior incidents at Faust's previous posting were referenced in the pattern of conduct section with the careful, permanent language of an institution that had stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. Faust's replacement was named 2 weeks after that. The behavioral health contract was reinstated at full value plus a retroactive adjustment for the 9-week gap. By order of the new base commander, who had read Marin's 43 days of incident documentation in one sitting and been very quiet afterward. Corbett's service record was formally reviewed at the classification level above what Marin could access. 13 years of sealed service, 3 unit commendations, a welfare protocol she had written for a task force that officially didn't exist. It was all reviewed. And then, in the language of institutional process that moves slowly and means things permanently, it was acknowledged. The acknowledgement came in the form of a letter, not a ceremony. A letter delivered by a man in civilian clothes who arrived in a government vehicle on a Tuesday and left 15 minutes later. Corbett read it sitting on the concrete step outside the kennel block. Marin sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. Full recognition, she said finally. Is that what it says? All 13 years, on record. She looked at the paper. My name on the unit, the dog's names on the unit. A pause. Ogle's name. Marin looked at the mountains. The snow that had been building for a week had finally come down from the higher elevations, and the peaks were white now, sharp against a blue that only happened at altitude. There's a position, he said. I submitted the request to Holden's office 2 weeks ago. Program Development Consultant, Kennel Welfare Protocol, based here initially, then district-wide as the curriculum develops. He looked at her, writing the behavioral assessment framework into official Army working dog retirement standard, your framework, based on your notes. She looked at him. The position description, he said, is specific enough that it reduces the eligible pool to approximately one person. She was quiet. Down the block, Tanaka was running the morning protocol with Scout. The old dog was at the front of his enclosure, watching her, ears forward. He wasn't pressing against the gate yet. That would come next week, or the week after, or on a day that Tanaka would remember specifically because it would feel like something she had worked for and earned. I'm going to have opinions, Corbett said. I'm counting on it. About handler rotation, about kennel layout, about the way facilities design spaces for dogs that are supposed to be retiring rather than just stopping. I know. And when something is wrong, I'm going to say so, in writing, on record. Thea, Marin said. She looked at him. It was the first time he'd used her first name. That is the specific thing I am hiring you to do. She looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at Scout at the end of the block, and Flint in the adjacent kennel beginning to orient toward the sound of Tanaka's footsteps. She looked at Recon, who had eaten a full breakfast that morning for the first time in 6 weeks, which Irby had documented with the particular careful understatement of a veterinarian who is pleased and knows better than to say so directly. Okay, she said. Not yes. Okay, which was different and more honest, the word you use when you have considered the real thing being offered and found it worth taking. She signed onto the consultant access register that afternoon, standing in front of the kennel block entrance where Irby had put a framed copy of the new behavioral welfare protocol on the wall. The protocol was named after the unit the 5 dogs had served in, and at the bottom, in the official language of a military base document, it read, "Developed in partnership with Thea Corbett, consulting specialist." Irby had drafted that language. Marin had approved it. They had not asked her, and she stood in front of it for a long moment when she saw it, and she didn't say anything, and the thing on her face was real in a way that had nothing performed in it. She signed the register. Her name, in her handwriting, on a document in a building where the record of what she'd given was on the wall, and the dogs she'd reached were alive in the kennels behind her. She held the pen for a second after she signed it. Marin, watching, understood why. It was her real name, in a real place, on a record that wasn't going anywhere. Same time tomorrow, she said. Same time tomorrow, he said. And that is the thing that matters, in the end, not the ceremony, not the speech, not the moment when everything resolves into something clean and uncomplicated. The world doesn't often produce that. The people who deserved recognition a decade ago don't always receive it in time for it to feel simple. But sometimes, not always, not without the mess and cost and imperfect weeks that preceded it, sometimes the record gets corrected. Sometimes the person who looked like just another temp, just someone covering a leave, just somebody's inconvenient opinion, sometimes that person gets to write their name in the right place and have it stay there. Corbett walked back into the kennel block to start her first official morning's work, and Scout came to the gate before she reached him, and the mountains were where they had always been, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was enough.